To Proverbs 31. There's some art that's there that our brother Richard, I don't see Richard today, but Richard drew this for us a couple weeks ago. I had asked Richard as he read through Proverbs to do some sketches for us, and maybe you're artistic and would like to do the same. Proverbs 31. And so it's if that's a gift that you have and you want to be involved in using that gift in the service of the Lord, please do so. Proverbs, as we close, has been a book on wisdom. It represents for us the words and work of Solomon, many of his proverbs, but also ones that he brought together, that collected the sayings of the wise. The great message of Proverbs is this, that you and I can be wise. The Bible tells us that if any of us lacks wisdom, that we're to ask God, who will give to us the wisdom that we need. And so it shows that dependent relationship that we're in, but also the great promises of God to supply what we need. And so the message being, we can be wise. We go to God for that wisdom. Ultimately, the Proverbs teaches us that wisdom, the fear of the Lord, is the beginning of wisdom. And so the first step to the path of true wisdom is to be reconciled to God and to have peace with him. And that peace is through the person of Jesus Christ and faith in him. A very misunderstood passage, not misunderstood completely, but a passage that has more to it than we probably imagined is Proverbs 31. Most often when we look at Proverbs 31, we look at verses 10 to 31. It's where we see all these qualities of an honorable woman, a woman of valor. But what I'd like to do today is to back up and to say, hey, you know what, if we take a bigger picture at the whole chapter, we will see a slightly different picture that maybe than we're used to, and that maybe will go against some of the stereotypes that we have about Proverbs 31. Proverbs 31, for some, it is a passage that is well loved. For others, it's a passage that they hate because of its depiction of women. And maybe just go to the next slide, Otto. I have a little bit of an introduction. When we think about the Proverbs as a whole, it's divided into two parts, verses 1 to 9, and then 10 to 31. In verses 1 to 9, it's Solomon's mother. Actually, the text, the word Lemuel is actually another word for Solomon. And there's a certain anonymity that's sort of granted in that word, but when you start to think about it, the universal, almost universal understanding is that it's Solomon speaking about himself and sharing with us words that his mother spoke to him. And what's kind of interesting, is I never realized before, is in the first part of the book of this chapter, it's Solomon is recounting for us how his mother had rebuked him. And that's verses 1 to 9. His mother is rebuking him, and then in verses 10 through 31, she then shares with him what he should be looking for in a wife. And so that is the two-part structure of Proverbs 31. Another neat thing about it is verses 10 to 31 is an acrostic based on the Hebrew alphabet. The Hebrew alphabet has 22 letters, so the equivalent is our A to Z, or A to Z, of a good wife. And key to the whole understanding is it's not Solomon saying what it makes for a good wife. It's his mother telling him what he should be looking for in a wife. So that sort of turns the passage around a little bit when you realize it's not a man speaking. It's actually Bathsheba, and which really adds another level to the whole thing, is because who of us knows the story of Bathsheba? Yeah, we know the story of Bathsheba. She got together with David. David stole someone else's wife, proceeded to murder her husband, and then married Bathsheba. And so here we have, years later, we show how the amazing grace and work of God is. That's what we know where she began, but we also have some clues about the wisdom that she added in righteousness. When one gets right with God, how things can turn around in a person's life. And here she's sharing with her son, this is what you should be looking for in a woman. And so we see she has become a woman of wisdom. The other neat thing is Proverbs 31 really is in the description, it's an acrostic, but one thing you'll note is that the woman is perfect. The reason she's perfect is because she is the embodiment of wisdom. Wisdom and foolishness are both depicted as women in the book of Proverbs. In Proverbs chapter 9, it speaks about how there's two women who sit on the highest points of the city, and they call out to people. There's the woman Folly, who says, "Come into my house." And the text tells us that inside her house is actually death in the end. And then there's the woman Wisdom, who sits on the highest point of the city, and both of them have the same message: "Come to me, all you who are naive. Come and learn." And the woman Wisdom is calling. And so here, as we close the book, wisdom becomes personified. Wisdom is a woman. And so when you read the book, when you read Proverbs 31 and you're like, this is like Superwoman, I can never be her. It's because it is wisdom perfected. She is, all the aspects of wisdom is bound up in this particular woman. So with that sort of as an introduction, let's have a look together. Let's go to the next slide, please. The best translation, I looked at a whole bunch of translations side by side, and the English Standard Version really captures, particularly in verse 2. In verse 2, it says, we'll get to verse 2 in a second. Let me read verses 1 to 9. "The words of King Lemuel, an oracle that his mother taught him. What are you doing, my son?" That tone is there. That tone is not necessarily captured very well in some of the other English translations, but the word is what. What, and what. What are you doing is what his mother says to him. What are you doing, my son? What? And then she amps it up. What are you doing, son of my womb? And then she says, what are you doing? What are you doing, my son? What are you doing, son of my womb? What are you doing, son of my vows? What exactly are you doing? Is what she says to her son. This is the words of rebuke. And he's recounting for us what his mother said to him. And this is what she rebukes him about. "Do not give your strength to women and your ways to those who destroy kings." In the Good News translation, which is a paraphrase, but it actually captures it very well, it says, "Don't spend all your energy on sex and all your money on women. They have destroyed kings." What's Solomon's mom telling him? You are obsessed with women and sex. It's going to wreck you. That's why she says, "What are you doing? What are you doing? What are you doing with your life?" That's what she's saying to him. It is not for kings. And then she rebukes him for another thing. "It is not for kings, O Lemuel. It is not for kings to drink wine, or for rulers to take strong drink, lest they drink and forget what has been decreed and pervert the rights of all the afflicted. Give strong drink to the one who is perishing, and wine to those in bitter distress. Let them drink and forget their poverty and remember their misery no more." The Message translation has an interesting take on that last part. It says, "Use wine and beer only as sedatives to kill the pain and dull the ache of the terminally ill, for whom life is a living death." Probably captures the sense. When she says give beer and wine to other people who are in the midst of suffering, it's like, use that as a sedative. You stop partying and drinking all the time, she says to her son. It's taking away your judgment and ruining your reputation as king. This is from his mom. Stop chasing women and stop partying all the time. Get your act together, is what his mother is saying to him. It's kind of bold of him to say all this, isn't it? This is transparent to say, this is what my mom told me. Stop doing all this stuff. And then she says, open your mouth. This is what you ought to be doing. Open your mouth for the mute, for the rights of all who are destitute. Open your mouth and judge righteously and defend the rights of the poor and needy. And so we have a rebuke about his distraction by women and sex, a rebuke over his alcohol consumption and partying lifestyle. And then she says, you're the king. Your job is to be standing up for the oppressed and doing what's right and just in the sight of God. You're to be looking after the poor. That's your role as king. And so immediately there's four great lessons that we have. One, this application, his mother's rebuke of him is not just for him. there's a message here about us, is that we need to get a handle on our sex drives and live in a way that honors God. That's a universal call to every single one of us. Don't let this get out of control in your life. And the Bible says about what's right and what's wrong in terms of our sexuality. We also need to make sure that alcohol and partying don't take over our lives. Thirdly, speaking up for the oppressed and taking care of the poor is a big thing that we're supposed to be concerned about as people. And fourthly, and actually I have a little slide for this, is a little reminder, parenting is for life. Right? She's not telling a 12-year-old off. She's telling a grown-up off. That, what are you doing with your life? Why are you living like this? You should know better. This is what God's standards are. Stop doing what you're doing. And you thought maybe you'd be done when your child was 21. Sorry. Parenting carries on, doesn't it? We know this. Parenting and being involved in our children's lives is a lifetime thing. And as children, we're reminded what our response is to be. Children are to honor their father and mother, no matter how old they be. And so the respect that we're to show to our parents carries on past the age of 18, which is, I know, a big mile marker in our lives when we're like adults, but our parents are still over us, and we're still responsible to them. So that's the first part. So that really is the key to understanding what she says next. The part that we're usually familiar with is the woman of valor, the virtuous woman, the woman that is just the perfect woman. And so after saying all these things, she then says, let me tell you about the kind of woman you should be looking for. She said, and Solomon had a problem with women. When you have 700 wives, you've got a problem. Yeah, and so she says, hey, I need to talk to you about your life. And so then we come to the second half. Now, one thing, and actually here's some two interpretive questions. These are hard questions, but good questions. For those of you who want to go deeper, after we read this, think about these two questions. To what degree does this text address gender roles? How does the Bible address the role of men and women in culture and society? And then what other passages does this text take us to? So if you like to study and think about big subjects, how does the text address the subject of gender roles? Second question is, in what ways does this passage positively affirm womanhood and manhood in contrast to our culture? There's our culture that tells us what it is to be a man and what it is for you to be a woman. But what does the Bible say about being a man? What does the Bible say about being a woman? And so how does our text affirm manhood and womanhood as opposed to what our culture is force-feeding us every day about what you should be as a man or as a woman? So those are some questions to follow up on a secondary level. So let's have a look at the second part of the passage. After rebuking her son, she then says, an excellent wife who can find? She is far more precious than jewels. The heart of her husband trusts in her, and he will have no lack of gain. She does him good and not harm all the days of her life. She seeks wool and flax and works with willing hands. She's like the ship of the merchant. She brings her food from afar. She rises while it is night and provides food for her husband and portions for her maidens. She considers a field and buys it. With the fruit of her hands, she plants a vineyard. She dresses herself with strength and makes her arms strong. She perceives that her merchandise is profitable. Her lamp does not go out at night. She puts her hands to the distaff, and her hands hold the spindle. So there's the whole weaving thing, making clothing and blankets and mats. She opens her hand to the poor and reaches out her hands to the needy. She's not afraid of snow for her household, and for all her household are clothed in scarlet. Scarlet would be a thicker material. So basically it's saying here is winter or summer or spring, doesn't matter the season, things are prepared and in place. She makes bed coverings for herself. Her clothing is fine linen and purple. Her husband is known in the gates where he sits among the elders of the land. She makes linen garments and sells them. She delivers sashes to the merchant. Strength and dignity are her clothing, and she laughs at the time to come. She opens her mouth with wisdom, and the teaching of kindness is on her tongue. She looks well to the ways of her household and does not eat the bread of idleness. Her children rise up and call her blessed. Her husband also, and he praises her. Many women have done excellently, but you surpass them all. And then it says, charm is deceptive, and beauty is vain or fleeting, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. Give her the fruit of her hands, and let her works praise her in the gates. And so a few things, as I mentioned off the top, it's an acrostic based on the Hebrew alphabet. The woman is perfect because she's wisdom embodied. And so those are different things to factor in. And the other thing is that once we step back from understanding those as sort of the bigger framework, we have Solomon's mother saying, this is the woman you should be looking for. These are the women that you've been involved with, but this is actually the kind of woman that you ought to be looking for. So we've asked the question is, what should a mother teach her son to look for in a girl? That's what his mom is doing, his grown-up mom, and he's grown up himself, and yet she's saying, hey, we need to have a chat about what you're doing with your life, and here's the qualities that are important. And so when we walk through it and say, okay, well, what is a mom to teach her son to look for in a girl? And I'll give a quick walkthrough. And as I mentioned earlier, very important to note who's talking. It's ultimately Bathsheba, who came from her own storied background and who had obviously grown a lot in her life, showing the grace of God. And so she didn't start out as an exemplary person, but it seems that she'd made a lot of strides, and it's because of the grace of God in her life. So she says, in verse 12, she talks about a woman who is concerned she does him good and not harm all the days of her life. She says, you need to find a woman who's concerned about your health and your good. Someone who will look after you. And now one other aspect, and we'll flip it around, is this text is not just directed at women. It's directed at a man. So we ask the question, and we'll ask the question, if these things are directed, if he's supposed to be looking for this, what kind of man is he supposed to be? That's the second question, which ramps up the text. And so we have this, a woman who's concerned about your health and your good, a woman who is industrious and hardworking, she says, this is what you're supposed to look for, a woman who is capable and educated and strong and good with money and a steward. What's very interesting is when I look at the passage, this is a woman who'd be very fine just on her own, right? Anyone who can do all this stuff doesn't need a guy, right? She's investing, she's spying, she's selling, she's got all the staff that she's looking after. This is not a woman who's like, I need a man in my life. She's a very capable person and would be fine just all on her own. But what is the neat thing about her is that that's not used against him. Rather, that is two people, the picture of marriage is when two people come together and walk side by side. And yet there's no weakness in this woman at all. And she's an incredibly strong person. She's also, verse 20, kind of a neat verse, and when Solomon's mom is telling him what to look for, she opens her hand to the poor and reaches out to her hands to the needy. And our attitude, and there's an application for us, is she says to him, you need to look for someone who's generous and who's caring and cares about the most vulnerable people in society. That's a person that you need to have an interest in. That our attitude towards the most vulnerable people says a whole lot about us as men and women. How we view the most vulnerable in society speaks a whole bunch about our character. The next point is she's also a woman in verse 21, 22, 27, 28 who is interested in children and family life. Now this one I know is a bit tricky. It's a painful subject for a variety of reasons, but let me go with one aspect of it, is children. First off, it is very difficult to have a child. Some people are not able to. That's not the focus of the text. It's just saying, as a viewpoint, you're looking for a woman, she says, that's interested in family and interested in children. That's part of your search. Doesn't mean that doesn't mean it's always going to be able to happen, but he says that there needs to be a yes to that in the person. And that's countercultural. We live in a culture where children are viewed as a secondary item. Like, if I can afford it, I might have one. But I'd rather go on a trip, so I might not want one. That's men and women view children that way in our culture. And the Bible actually says, what's the first command in the whole of the Bible? Be fruitful and multiply. The very first command God gives it regards family. And so when a person says, I hate kids, I don't want kids, I think they're disgusting and all this stuff. And at least when the Bible starts to shape your view, that view should change. Because it doesn't mean everyone's necessarily going to be able to have children, and I know that's very hard. But that view needs to shift, because a biblical view says family is a big deal, and being willing and open to that. So that's that's where we see culture in the Bible running right into each other, full speed ahead. And our point as Christians is not to think like our culture, but to think like Christians, people shaped by the Word of God. And then another point is in verse 26, a woman, she says, you should look for a woman who is, when she opens her mouth with wisdom, and the teaching of kindness is on her lips, on her tongue. He says, look for a woman of gentle speech. And the same thing would be flipped around to, if a woman is looking for a husband, don't look for the loudest person in the room. That's the gentleness of speech, man or woman. It's important that if a person's really loud and brash and arrogant and insulting to other people, and you're not yet married, well, it doesn't mean it's impossible, because God changes us. Thank God for that. There's the work of God in our lives. But she's saying, as a general principle, pay attention to how people talk. And because that's going to impact you going forward, and the same as a girl or a guy. And then ultimately there's a call to be looking for a woman of faith. It's kind of interesting. Proverbs 31 makes no direct reference to God. God isn't mentioned in Proverbs 31, and yet the inference is clearly there, because to be a woman of wisdom, the entire book of Proverbs teaches us that a woman of wisdom is a woman of righteousness. Wisdom and righteousness go hand in hand. Foolishness and wickedness go hand in hand. And so to be a wise woman is to be a woman of righteousness, who for her is faith comes first. And so she's counseling him that, hey, you're to find a woman of wisdom, you're to find a woman of righteousness, and it will go well with you. And so we have an application. It's an honorable thing when we think about Proverbs 31. As high as the bar is, it's an honorable thing to ascribe to want to be a woman, a Proverbs 31 woman. It is the woman wisdom. And so to say, hey, these are the goal. These are some things that I'd like to see in my life. That's an honorable calling and an honorable desire of one's heart. But there's more than that, because go to the next slide, please, Otto. And as we go forward, Proverbs 31 does more than just tell a man what he should look for in a wife. Bathsheba, when she says this to her son, we also realize that the passage at the very same time is teaching husbands how they should be towards their wives. It's not just, here's what to look for, honey, in a woman. Embedded and woven through the fabric of the passages, as a man, you have some responsibility in a marriage relationship. It's not just a one-way street. It speaks in the passage, in the scriptures in the entire whole. A husband is to encourage his wife. A husband is to support his wife. In Ephesians 5, a husband is to lay down his life for his wife. There's nothing a husband shouldn't be willing to do, as long as it's moral, for his wife. We have as our ultimate pattern the sacrifice of Jesus Christ himself. It says in verse 28, a husband is to celebrate his wife. What does it say? Her children rise up and call her blessed. Her husband also, and he praises her. I was reading some Jewish commentaries, and in some Jewish households, the husband will actually sing Proverbs 31, 10 to 31 to his wife as words of praise to her. So there's a song for us guys to learn, right? Rather than reading it out as here's what you ought to be, honey, this passage doesn't allow for that. The passage flips it and says, this is what you are to praise your wife for. You're to be complimentary, and you are to be in praise of your wife who is devoted to Christ, and you are to lift her up and exalt her. That's what the passage is teaching. The other neat thing is a husband is to trust his wife with the family money. What happens in this is a tricky one, but it's in the Bible. The heart of her husband trusts in her, and he will have no lack of gain. Trust in relationships, trust in marriage. We need to take some steps in our marriages for them to be strong, and trust is a big thing. Building, working on trust, and not being so suspicious of each other all the time. And money is right in the heart of it. And so when you think about marriage, having all things in common. And if you don't like it, you better go just say, God, I don't like that verse. Because it's right in the Bible. I'm not making it up. But foundations for a successful relationship, talking about bringing all things together and how trust is a foundation. And sometimes we lose trust, but we got to work back towards it. And we submit ourselves to Christ and say, God, I want to be the person that you want me to be. I want to be the husband I'm supposed to be. And if you're a woman, I want to be the wife I'm supposed to be. And we both devote ourselves to Christ, and we seek to make things work. Another thing is, the passage teaches us what children are to be towards their mother and their father. In particular, it says, it reminds children of their duty to honor their mothers. Her children rise up and call her blessed, which takes us to the 5th commandment of the Bible. Honor your father and your mother. The Bible never lets us forget that. Honor your father and your mother. And so it speaks about her children rise up and call her blessed. Number 3, and we're almost done. Because the woman of Proverbs 31 is wisdom personified, the principles of the text apply both to men and to women. Because she is wisdom personified, there's a crossover in application. So for example, have a look at verse 28. Verse 28 is a well-known, verse 30. Verse 30 is a well-known verse. Charm is deceptive and beauty is fleeting, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. It's not just women who get old, right? Men get old and wrinkly too. So what's the passage saying there? Is that just for women? Of course not. It's for both men and women. You could flip it around. You could say, well, hey, a charming guy is deceitful. That charm from a man is deceitful. And a handsome guy, that's just on the surface, isn't it? What's your ultimate goal? Is godly character. And so we're reminded, one thing we don't want to be reminded, we're reminded that we get older and things change. That's life. But we're reminded what's the most important thing about us is character. Character, 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 character. Godly character is the thing that matters most. And so when we think about these principles, this is not just for women. If women are to be hardworking, what are men supposed to be? Couch potatoes? No. Right? If women are to be hardworking and industrious, men are to be hardworking and industrious. If women are supposed to be generous and needy to the poor, what's a guy supposed to be? Generous and needy. She says you should look for a lady that is kind in her speech, what should a guy be in his speech? Because this is wisdom personified, the principles go both ways. And so it is more than just here's what you should look for in a wife. It's way, way bigger than that in this passage. And then the last thing is, Proverbs 31, it ultimately takes us to Jesus. How does it take us to Jesus? Because when you and I look down the list of the qualities of wisdom, all of a sudden we realize, I'm not necessarily all of that. I fall short. And when we fall short, when we sin, where does our sin supposed to take us to? It's supposed to take us to Jesus, who died for our sin, who took the punishment that we deserve for the things that we've done against God and against others. And so this passage, when we say the only way to be a person like this is to have Christ in me. It takes us right to Christ, who is ultimate wisdom. Everything about wisdom is Jesus. Jesus is the absolute perfection of wisdom. And so here we have the woman wisdom who takes us to the person of Jesus Christ. And so that's Proverbs 31. You and I, for a long time, when we thought of Proverbs, we just thought of a list of, here's a whole bunch of qualities women are supposed to have. No, that's not the right take on the passage at all. It begins with a stern tongue lashing from a mother to a son. What are you doing? What are you doing? What are you doing? And she tells her adult son off for not living the way he ought to be living. And then she says, you know, this is what your eye is supposed to be on when it comes to women. But it then expands, because she's also really, it's a lesson on wisdom as a whole. This is the person you're supposed to be. And then we realize, I can't be this person on my own. I can only become this person with Christ in me, which brings us all together on the same playing field, doesn't it? Needful of the work of Christ in our lives, and thankful that while we're yet sinners, Christ died for us. So let's stand together as we sing our closing song.